Hello, Year 12, and welcome to the screencast, and I should say welcome to the Desk Sixth Form. Speaking personally, the Sixth Form was one of the most interesting periods of my life, and most of you are really going to enjoy this period because finally you get to choose the subjects that you're really interested in. But no matter which subject you're doing, critical thinking is something that we all need to know about. So I prepared a short little workshop that you're going to do with your tutors today. So specifically, what are we doing today? We're going to look firstly at what critical thinking is. We're again going to move on to what we call thought experiments that are used in philosophy. And the most important one we're going to look at today is called the trolley problems. These are really interesting because they examine your moral views and they put them to the test. And then the final thought experiment that we're going to look at is a really exciting, interesting one called the ticking time bomb scenario, where we decide whether torture is morally permissible or not. And then for my conclusion, I'm going to look at why critical thinking matters and why it's so valuable, particularly in sixth form study as you prepare for university. And my final conclusion will be to look at the role of the super curriculum in your studies. So let's get started. Why critical thinking? What's the importance of it? Well, the problem in life is that everybody thinks. It is our nature to do so. But a lot of our thinking is actually biased, distorted, partial, uninformed, and downright prejudiced. Now, John Dewey says over here, critical thinking must be cultivated. It doesn't happen naturally. So my very easy definition of critical thinking is thinking clearly, rationally, and in a non-contradictory way. Now, in philosophy, quite often people use what they call thought experiments. Now, philosophers use thought experiments because these imaginary scenarios allow you to test the logic of your argument. In philosophical terms, they test the premises, the things that you say you think are true. And in many cases, they are not. Philosophy always tries to establish what we call first principles, okay? And these first principles are boiling down problems so that they cannot be reduced any further. I'm going to ask you to think about three different premises here. Firstly, saving several human lives is better than saving only one. True or false? Human lives are of equal value. True or false? And it is totally unacceptable to torture people. True or false? Now you have a piece of paper in front of you and you can quickly record your response to these first principles. Now you've had a moment to think about those. Let's go through and start to think about them really carefully. So the first premise is saving a lot of people's lives is better than saving one life. I think for most of us, we would find that intuitively our instincts would tell us that that's true. Human lives are of equal value. That's a more interesting one, isn't it? Is it true to say that the life of a serial killer or a terrible criminal is equal to the life of, say, a great scientist who's going to do amazing work in the world? That will very much depend on your value system. So I want you to hold on to that thought because in a moment we're going to test them. And this is going to be the one that I find the most interesting. It is totally unacceptable to torture people. Now, to a lot of us, that's not a controversial principle. We would actually agree with the United Nations, who have outlawed torture and said that it is never acceptable or not. Now we're going to look at a number of moral scenarios where we're going to test these first principles and see whether they stand up to scrutiny or not. Now I've given you a paper with this scenario, but I'm going to explain it to you first so that you can think very carefully about the moral choice that you are going to make. So, we call these the trolley problems. but really it's more like a runaway train. So here we are, we have a train which is a runaway train. We have some workers that are on the track, who you can see over here. 5 workers. On the other side of the track, we have 1 worker. So trolley problem number 1, moral problem number 1 that I'm going to set you to think about is, if we have the ability over here to pull a lever which will stop the train killing the 5 workers and redirect it onto the track over here, would we pull the lever, thus saving the 5 people, but killing the first person? I would like you to think very clearly about that and to write down a short answer. Tutors, can you pause the video now? Give the students some time to think about this before they discuss the reasons for their choice with you. Now, most people don't find this a very difficult critical thinking problem because they believe that it is moral to save human lives. If we go back to the first premises, the first principles that we spoke of earlier, the first principle that it is better to save many lives than one seems to be the one that most of us instinctively follow. There are, of course, some exceptions to this. Now let's move on to a more controversial one, shall we? Trolley problem number 2 is quite similar. We have the 5 workers on one side and we have another person on the other side. But I'm going to change it slightly and say these 5 workers here are all lifelong prisoners who've committed terrible crimes. On the other side, we have a person who is the greatest medical scientist in the world and who is reputed to be working on the cure for cancer. Tutors, can I ask you to pause the video once again and to let the class decide whether they would redirect the trolley into the path of the single person or allow it to move forward. Thank you very much. Now, some of you may have found this a much more difficult problem. We have the problem of the value of life. Whether these people on this track, whether their lives are not as valuable as the great scientists that we've spoken about on the other track. Now, as you can see from my pyramid that I have here, in medieval times, people often believed that the life of the king and the life of the most important and wealthy people was far more important than the life of peasants. But today, a lot of us are reticent. We're worried about this idea that some lives are superior to others. And your response will tell you about your first principles, whether you think it's the case that lives are equal or whether you still believe in some kind of idea of a hierarchy of human life. Now to move on to a much more difficult trolley problem that really perplexes and confuses a lot of people. I'll be very interested to see how you will respond to this. Trolley problem number 3 is often called the large man problem. So we have the same scenario. The out of control trolley is coming down and it's going to hit the workers over here. You have the ability here to have the lever, but this one is different. Rather than you being this agent here, you are now this agent here. You see that the trolley is going to kill the 5 people, and in front of you is a large man. He is large enough so that if he fell onto the tracks, it would stop the trolley and nobody would be killed this side. Trolley problem number 3. Tutors, can you give the students some time to decide what is the correct moral action? Would they push the large man onto the tracks and stop the trolley, thus saving the human lives on this side. Now you've had time to discuss trolley problem number 3, the trolley problem of the large man. Now this one seems to be much more difficult, and you'll get an even split between people. Usually people feel instinctively that it is definitely different to pull a lever from actually pushing someone onto the tracks. But why this is sometimes difficult to actually explain. Many of you, when you go back to your original first principle, would agree with the idea that the preservation of human life is a good thing, that it's better to save many lives rather than one. But this trolley problem calls that first principle into question, and it makes us think very carefully. Now, I use this trolley problem a lot with my philosophy students to show them that many of the things that we assume to be true, when we actually put them into a real life situation, we start to question that. And it's going to get even more complex than this in my next thought experiments. And now we get on to a more controversial topic. I'm going to ask you to write down whether you believe that it is wrong to torture people. As you can see from the picture that I have on this slide, torture was common in medieval times, and some Christian people argued that by burning somebody alive, you were actually saving their soul, and therefore it was a moral action sometimes to torture people. That's a very difficult concept for us to understand in the present age, because the United Nations has an outright ban on torture. And so for many of you, you might feel that torture is unacceptable. So please answer that question. Is it wrong to torture people? And now we're going to put that moral principle to the test. We're moved on from the trolley problem, and now we're going to look at what we call the ticking time bomb scenario. You've apprehended a terrorist. You know that he has planted a nuclear device. Scientists tell you that it will kill millions of people. The only possible way to find the location of the bomb and to stop this terrible massacre is to torture the terrorist. I'm going to ask you now, if you were in charge, is it morally permissible to torture the terrorist? Tutors, I'm going to stop the video now and ask students to think very carefully about their responses. Now, as with the other thought experiments, there is no wrong or right answer. What becomes interesting is, did you earlier say that torture is always wrong? If so, you are now in a state of contradiction, and it shows us how difficult it is to actually establish first principles that we never change. Some people might answer that they would not actually act, but unfortunately that isn't a position that works either, because as we know from history, often not acting at all can also be immoral. Picture, for instance, that you know that Hitler has the intention of killing millions of people and starting the Second World War. Is it immoral if you refuse to act? Most people would say, yes, it is. Now, if you thought that the first ticking time bomb scenario was difficult, I'm going to make it even more difficult for you. Some of you would have been prepared to torture the terrorist who had planted the device. But what if the terrorist had been taught to withstand torture? He'd done the most amazing training in the world, and it was very likely that the torture would be ineffective. The only person that the torturer, the terrorist, truly loves is his wife. As they are so close, it is likely that she knows the location of the bomb. My question to you, and it's the final question of this session, is it morally permissible to torture the wife in order to find the bomb and prevent the deaths of millions of people? Tutors, give the students some time to think. Now, this is perhaps for many of you the most difficult moral question of all. There seems to be a difference between a terrorist who plants a device and his wife. And you may agree with torture in one case, but not in another. It is a very difficult problem. And once again, I stress that there is no real answer. And now I'm going to move on to the idea of how this links to critical thinking. What I hope that you've seen today is that very often we have all kinds of assumptions and habits of mind, which when we put to the test, they don't really stand out. And we find ourselves changing our mind and contradicting ourselves. If we're doing this, this is critical thinking at its best, because we are really problem solving. We're looking at problems and we're finding solutions. We're looking carefully at the decisions we make, at how we make them. What are the reasons for them? Are they rational? Are they consistent? Are they logical? Critical thinking also involves research skills. Naturally, as you saw today, it's very creative. You look for new solutions. And above all, it stimulates curiosity. So what's the relevance to sixth form study? The relevance is that top achieving people, whether it be in BTEC or A-level, are people who employ critical thinking. They're people who think beyond the course. They think about the wider implications of the course. Now, the final thing that I want to say today is you have the opportunity in the sixth form of doing the EPQ, the extended project qualification, and to engage in what we call the super curriculum, ideas of academic extension. These will give you access and foster critical thinking, creativity, resilience, research skills, communication and writing skills, and above all, real-world learning. So if you've enjoyed some of these scenarios today, or you want to sharpen your critical thinking faculties, please take advantage of all of the clubs, the EPQ, and the academic enrichment options that are available to you. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see some of you in my philosophy and politics society.